There are a total of 25 new Ashes of War in the DLC. Now, not to be confused with unique skills, those things are different. So there's Sombra-based weapons that have those really cool skills. We're not going to talk about those ones today, but don't worry, we're going to talk about them soon enough. Alongside all the new spells, talismans, crystal tears, we're going to break down how they work, all the numbers. So definitely do subscribe for that. Now, yes, typically when I do these ranking videos, I like to have a complete playthrough with every single one of these things first. So I'm not going to be at my most knowledgeable when talking about these skills, but there's so much stuff to cover nowadays that I don't really have the time to do complete playthroughs. Also, I'm not going to be going over locations for spoiler reasons, so if you did want to know, just ask the question down in the comments. Anyway, let's get into it. Starting off at the bottom, we have Piercing Throw for the new Throwing Blades. Now, Throwing Blades are just not a good weapon class at all. They do very bad damage, don't go very far, get no tracking. The projectiles feel like they just miss more times than they can actually connect. And this weapon skill is just another mediocre attacking option to put onto them. The damage is not even that good. The projectile gets no tracking, doesn't really go that far, only does 3 stance damage. It does travel quicker than like the regular projectile that you get with a throwing blade, but being how bad the damage is of these weapons is still not going to be that useful. The only positive thing I can say is that it does only consume 8 FP, but throwing blades definitely need to get buffed because their damage is not that good. Number 24, Wall of Sparks, which is only equipable on the perfume bottles. Now for 16 FP, it basically shoots out a bunch of this like gunpowder surrounding you, and then you can explode it after a couple seconds to do a decent amount of damage. Can stagger enemies pretty nicely too. Now depending on what type of perfume bottle you do have and what element it actually is, will be dependent on which element the attack actually is as well. So no, not every single perfume bottle is going to be doing fire damage. But the reason I'm going to have this so low on the list is because the heavy attack does the exact same thing, but just better. A much faster animation, can do more damage, does like twice as much stance damage because this skill only does like 10 stance damage. And just overall much more consistent. I don't know why they made this skill have such a delayed explosion and a long animation that you get no hyper armor in. Like you can get staggered out of it very easily. And it's consuming FP, like you're better off just using the heavy attack almost every single time. Number 23, we have Shield Strike, which is equipable on all of these shields. And this basically is just a regular light attack. It just lets you attack with your skill, which basically means when you have a shield in your left hand, you can click L2 to just do like a regular light attack. Because typically when you click L1 or the left bumper, it's going to block with a shield. So it just gives you the option to attack itself. Number 22, we have GHOSTFLAME Call, which is going to be a magic-based Ash of War that is equipable on swords and spears. And this is identical to the Death Poker in every single way. It looks exactly the same. It has the same FP cost. The only difference being is that the Death Poker weapon skill actually does good damage. This one sucks. I don't know why. It's probably bugged, but the damage is like 3 times as bad as Death Poker. The frost buildup is just horrendous. And yes, I tried it with multiple different infusions, with multiple different weapons, and for some reason, it is just not performing as well. Don't know why that is. Hopefully they do buff it to where it's actually somewhat more in line with the Death Poker. Now, if they do bring it more in line to where the Death Poker actually is, would that make the Death Poker useless? Probably if you do have access to both of them, but let's not forget the Death Poker is in the base game at the very beginning, and this is going to be in the DLC. Number 21, BLINKBOLT. This is going to be a lightning-based skill that you can equip onto every single type of weapon. And basically what it does is give you an iframe dodge in this really cool like lightning animation. The lightning animation actually does do damage as well. Doesn't do any stance damage, but yeah, the damage itself is obviously not going to be that good. The only purpose of it is to close in the distance pretty quickly. Now this is obviously going to be compared to Bloodhound Step. And Bloodhound Step might be better in some cases because it does have a quicker starting up frames. This one is a bit more delayed. And Bloodhound Step actually does go into a rolling attack, where this one actually doesn't go into a rolling attack. It just continues the combo. But the benefit of this is that it's basically instantaneous. Before you even finish the dodging animation, you can actually queue up your input to start your light attack or heavy attack. And it can actually come out very quickly. But yeah, unfortunately, that's going to be its only benefit, is to close the distance pretty quickly to start your combos. Because if you wanted to use it as a regular dodge, I think Bloodhound Step or just normal dodging in itself is going to be better. And I can't really put it too much higher on the list because it doesn't really do that much more to where it's worth using it over like your regular dodge and actually a good damaging based weapon skill. But it does look really cool. We have a Raging Beast for the Beast Claws. Now for 7 FP, it actually does do this little sideward dash and this quick downward slam. Now it doesn't really seem like it's much, but this little sideways dash actually does have iframes. and the starting up frames are very quick, so you actually can use it as a dodge and immediately punish it afterwards with a very quick attack that can stagger enemies nicely. Now I kind of did wish it did like 2 swings instead of just 1, because I feel like the damage can be a bit lacking, but thankfully there actually is a follow-up input that does have you jump it in the air again and do another couple of swiping attacks. Now, unfortunately, this jumping animation doesn't get any hyper armor, so you can get staggered out of it. I kind of wish the follow-up attack did have some iframes as well. Probably would have liked it a bit more. Now, another thing about this skill is that it is very hard to control. Your character just moves all over the place, which can be a downside, but can also be a positive, because enemies are just less likely to hit you as well. There are so many times to where they can just miss too. So overall, it is a pretty decent skill to boost your neutral game, but it's not going to be the most highest damaging. Number 19, we have IGON'S Dragon Hunt, which is going to be for the Great Bows. And this is essentially like the Mighty Shot equivalent, but for the Great Bows. It just makes your next attack just do a lot more damage, but it does have a longer starting up animation. Now, from my testing, the damage boost is actually 75%, more than a regular attack, which is obviously really good. Now, if you did want to know, it does not work with the Roar Medallion, even though the character does like roar and screech before he does shoot his shot. And also in comparison to the Through and Through Ash of War, that one also does more damage than a regular Great Bow shot, but only by like 20 or 30%. But the benefit of Through and Through is that it can actually bypass through enemies and hit them multiple times. So against those really large bosses, Through and Through is going to be like your best option. But if you just want single target damage to just snipe enemies at a distance, then IGON'S Dragon Hunt is going to be your best bet. Number 18, we have Savage Lion's Claw, which you basically can equip onto all larger types of weapons. And it is going to be like a reskinned version of regular Lion's Claw. And Lion's Claw is already one of the best ashes, if not the best ash in the entire game. And it basically takes the same skill, but gives it a follow-up double swinging attack, which typically you might think is just going to be the better option. But unfortunately, I do not think that is the case, because the first swing of Savage Lion's Claw isn't going to be as fast as regular Lion's Claw, does less damage, and most importantly, does way less stance damage too. I did the testing. With the Guts' Greatsword, it does 12 stance damage with Savage Lion's Claw for the first swing, which for comparison, regular Lion's Claw does 36 stance damage. And that's going to do it in a faster animation, do more damage for the same FP cost. Now, obviously, Savage Lion's Claw does have that follow-up attack. And with that follow-up attack, it actually does do more damage. And when you do hit that second and third time, it is going to also do 36 stance damage. And that total amounts for that second and third swing can just do more than Lion's Claw. And it is only going to consume an additional 10 FP. And obviously this part of the animation is also going to have that infinite amount of hyper armor to where like you can just never get staggered out of. Very similar to Lion's Claw. But the problem is there's not going to be many bosses, especially in the DLC, that's going to let you like wait around long enough to have you just get 2 whole swings off. And if they do, you're better off just using 2 Lion's Claw swings, because that's going to do more stance damage and more damage. But the only downside is that it actually can consume a bit more FP. Savage Lion's Claw does hit like 1 additional time, so maybe it's better with like the multi-hit talismans or maybe like status effect type of builds. But I feel like there are other skills out there that are better at doing that. So for the most part, I do think this skill is outclassed by Lion's Claw, but it does have its own specific uses. Number 17, Aspect of the Crucible Wings. Now this skill can be equipped on most weapons that are capable of thrusting attacks. And for 22 FP, you become airborne, gain a whole bunch of hyper armor, and do this nice poking attack that can actually just go past enemies and potentially hit multiple enemies at once. And when using this skill with a twin blade, it actually does this whole flowering attack that can do some nice damage, and it can actually help proc the multi-hit talismans pretty quickly. Now, unfortunately, being that this is actually a sacred-based Ash of War, you cannot infuse it with different types of status effects, and there are no twin blades that can be infused that come with a passive status effect like bleed or frost. So unfortunately, it's not going to have that synergy there. But some other downsides that I do have about the Crucible Wings is that it is a longer animation that you can get punished very easily on. And I feel like the total overall damage isn't really quite there for only 22 FP. There are other skills that cost about this much that are just as easy to use, that can do more damage and more stance damage too, because this thing does do 22 stance damage. But it does have the use of being able to fly pretty far, so sometimes you actually can go past your enemy, and you might be able to dodge into safety as well. And also, as I mentioned, you can potentially hit multiple enemies at once. So it is going to be a skill that's easier to use, but I do feel it being more situational. Number 16, we have Scattershot Throw, which this is quite literally the only way to make throwing blades viable. This skill just shoots out like dozens of different types of throwing blades all in front of you. And this can actually make you do respectable damage. Obviously make it that you don't really miss as much. And if you're pairing this alongside like a bleed type of build, you can proc bleed very quickly. And with how much you can spam it over and over again, it can actually output some pretty decent damage for only 11 FP per cast. Now, unfortunately, like the damage is still going to be a bit lackluster because it is going to be off a throwing blade. This weapon definitely needs a boost in base damage because it is just not that good. But if you did want to use that weapon, definitely equip this skill. Number 15, DRYLEAF Whirlwind, which is a skill that you can only equip onto the hand-to-hand weapons. And for 14 FP, you become airborne and do this whole bunch of like flurrying kick attacks. Now, unfortunately, you do not get any hyper armor throughout this animation, so you can get staggered out of it and come crash into the ground. But the good thing is that it does actually stagger those larger types of enemies like knights and omens, and it can just stun lock them throughout the entire animation. And it can do 28 stance damage, which is actually very decent and is just as much as a charged heavy attack. But being that charged heavy attacks can potentially just do more damage, in most cases you are better off just going with that one, unless once again you are going up against those smaller enemies that can get staggered easily, and that's going to be the main use of this skill. And yes, if you didn't know already, these things do work with the multi-hit talismans, but I would like it more if it did have some hyper armor. Number 14, we have Rolling Sparks, which is probably the best Ash of War to put onto the perfume bottles. The damage itself is actually really good. It shoots out a bunch of these explosive projectiles in front of you. Against enemies that like to move around a whole bunch, it is not going to be good because as soon as you click the button, it's literally stuck to go in that one location. You can't redirect it, doesn't track anywhere, and in most cases you're going to miss. And also, enemies have to be standing directly in the middle because that's where it explodes the most. If enemies are too close, to the left, to the right, far away, it's not going to be doing good damage at all. But if they're standing directly inside of it, it's going to melt them. So against larger bosses, it's going to perform extremely well. Like, it is just going to melt them, decimate them, because all those explosions will end up hitting. It's going to do a decent amount of stance damage, maybe like at least 15. And for only 14 FP and how quick you can spam it over and over again, it definitely is going to be the best option for the perfume bottles, but against those smaller enemies, I would avoid using it. Number 13, we have the Poison Flower Blooms Twice. Now, this Ash of War can be equipped on all different types of melee attacking weapons, and it basically serves as a Scarlet Rot kicking attack. Every single hit does proc with roughly about 200 rot buildup. Now, the damage and the stance damage is nothing too crazy, but the major benefit of it is that once you do proc something like rot or poison, when you use the skill next, it actually will do bonus damage. Now, from my testing, it's roughly like twice the amount of damage, which is obviously really good. And the fact that it can work with both rot and poison means that you can go into a build that actually utilizes both and just keep maximizing that really good damage. Now, I still consider it to be somewhat more situational because against those larger bosses that are going to have a lot of health, I'd rather just let the Scarlet Rot just play out, because the Scarlet Rot can just result in a flat 15% damage or 30% damage depending on the source. And removing that might end up being worse. However, its synergy with the poison does make it a lot better, so you can actually go into a poison type of build, because regular poison doesn't really tick for as much. I can guarantee there will be very good and specific builds that you can build around this thing because it does have such a high upside, but some of those uses might be a bit more niche. Number 12, we have Savage Claws, which is for the Beast Claws. Now, this skill for 13 FP just does a whole bunch of these flowering attacks that can stagger smaller enemies, stun lock them, do a total of 22 stance damage, and it can proc status effects very quickly. And being that these things have bleed, is this going to make for a very nice pairing? You could definitely build around these to do very high amounts of damage with the multi-hit talismans, all the bleed types of buffs, and it could definitely melt a lot of enemies. Now, there are going to be some downsides. One, it does not get any hyper armor, and it has a longer animation. So if you do go up against those enemies that cannot get staggered, you're not going to be having a good time. So it's just going to be one of those skills to where you use it against those smaller enemies, and when you go up against those larger enemies that cannot get staggered, you probably just stick with your light attacks and heavy attacks. Number 11, Divine Beast Frost Stomp. This is just going to be like an upgraded version of Hoarfrost Stomp. It can be equipped on all different types of weapons, and it's just going to proc Frost very quickly and do it in a nice solid AoE that can do some respectable damage. Now, from my testing, it is about 20% more damage than regular Hoarfrost Stomp. And unlike Hoarfrost Stomp, this thing actually does do stance damage. Hoarfrost Stomp literally gets none. This one at least gets 5, but you can fully charge it as well to make it do 10 stance damage. And this obviously make it do more damage in total. And you can just pair it alongside the Godfrey's icon to further enhance that damage. But yeah, the skill itself is a very quick, easy to use AoE attack that can hit multiple enemies at once, hit enemies that like to dodge and move around, and just proc Frost, which is one of the best statuses in the game. Number 10, Overhead Stance for the Great Katanas. Now, this skill, if you're looking at it to be like the unsheathed equivalent, it is not going to be that. The stance damage is not that high. The light attack gives you 11 stance damage, and the heavy attack gives you a total of 22, which is still okay. but it's not going to be anywhere near as good as some things like Square Off or Unsheath. But that is not to say that this skill is bad at all, because the first light attack option does give you a quick downward chop, which doesn't seem like much, but it is a very quick swing, and you're swinging with a great katana, which is a very large weapon, so it's going to result in some very good damage. And as for the heavy attack, it is going to be like a 3 quick downward chops that does have you get stuck in that animation. You can't really cancel or roll out of it, but it's definitely going to be doing really good damage, and being that the great katana does get passive bleed, you're going to be proccing status effects really nicely. Spinning Gravity Thrust, which this skill can be equipped on all larger types of weapons capable of thrusting attacks, and yes, that is going to include things like Colossal Swords. You can put this on a big boy weapon like the Guts' Greatsword, and just fly through the air, stun lock these enemies, and just do high amounts of damage. You can honestly look at this skill as like an alternative to the Dragon King's Cragblade. The skill of this weapon actually did just get nerfed to where it does a lot less stance damage now. It went from like almost 70 stance damage to like less than 50. And this weapon skill with a Colossal Sword or even like a Great Spear can just do around about that 50 stance damage. And unlike the Dragon King's Cragblade, this skill actually does work with the multi-hit talismans. So actually can help stack that damage up a lot more when you're in that tornado spinning attack, and by the time you come crashing to the ground, you're doing so much more damage. And while you're in this airborne animation, you basically have infinite hyper armor. You're like never going to get staggered out of it. Now this obviously isn't going to be without any downsides. The major one being is that it is going to be a longer animation. It isn't going to be the easiest skill to use or control, and the total combo can consume 38 FP, which is on the higher end, but the damage and stance damage is well worth it. Flame Skewer. This is going to be a fire-based skill that can be equipped onto all types of weapons that are capable of thrusting attacks, and this is actually going to include larger types of weapons like Colossal Swords. Now the skill itself for 18 FP does a very similar animation to Giant Hunt, but it just has a fire-based attack instead, and actually does it a lot faster, and Giant Hunt is already one of the best skills in the game. But the differences being is that Giant Hunt can send enemies flying in the air, and it is going to do a lot more stance damage. That one doing 36 stance damage with a Colossal Sword, this one doing about 24 stance damage. However, it actually does have a couple of benefits. One, it does get a follow-up attack, of which is going to be a quick fire-based AoE, which is only for an additional 8 FP, can do some nice damage and stagger enemies, and it also does do 15 stance damage, so the entire combo can actually do a total of 39 stance damage for only 26 FP in a very quick animation. And also after using that first part of the skill, the weapon just gets a fire buff. You just get plus 95 fire damage for 15 seconds, which yes, that is not going to be as long as things like Flaming Strike or Flame Spear, as we will get into, but with how quick the animation is of the skill, you can keep spamming it over and over again and just keep retaining the buff. Number 7, we have Swift Slash for the backhanded blades. Now, I initially had this one lower on the list, and then I was talking about it and using it more, and then I was like, no, this thing is actually insane. For 16 FP, you do this really quick dashing attack that lunges very far, does some nice damage, and does get this little aftershock wave attack as well. Now, this invisible dodge forwards does not have iframes, from my testing at least, and the aftershock wave effect does not proc with the multi-hit talismans. But the total overall damage for this skill uncharged can do just as much as a charged heavy attack of this weapon, which the charged heavy attack itself is really good, serves as a nice lunging attack, but the skill can just lunge further, quicker, and do just as much damage for only 16 FP. But best of all yet, you can actually fully charge this skill to make it go even further and do even more damage, especially when paired alongside the Godfrey's icon, and it's still going to consume that same 16 FP. Like, this attack closes the distance so quickly, and this does amazing damage. It's such an easy to use skill with like very little downsides. Number 6, we have Blind Spot, which is another skill for the backhanded blades, and this one is also just insane. You get like an instant iframe dodge that just goes into a quick poking attack, which yes, this attack is going to be doing piercing damage, which not only has a lot of enemies in this game just weaker to this damage type, but also counterattack damage exists, of which when you hit an enemy while they're in the middle of an animation, this damage type is just going to be doing even more damage. And with how quick that it does swing, and the fact that you can do it directly after a dodge, means that more times than not, you're going to be hitting while an enemy is in an animation. And the whole animation is very quick, you do nice damage, and only 9 FP. Like, it's just 9 FP, you can spam it over and over again. Well, probably not spam it over and over again because it doesn't have the most forgiving stamina cost, but it is a very easy to use skill with many upsides. Number 5, we have Shriek of Sorrow. This skill can be equipped on all different types of weapons. And basically how it works for 19 FP is that it gives you a weapon buff. Now from my testing, this is actually going to be a 12% weapon buff that lasts 40 seconds. Which yes, you might be thinking it is going to be directly outclassed by Cragblade because that's a 15% damage boost. And it also boosts your stance damage by 10% and lasts 60 seconds. However, with Shriek of Sorrow, the lower your health, the more damage you actually do. And from my testing, when you have about half health, you're doing 22% more damage. And when you have less than a quarter health, you're doing 27% more damage. And this is a buff that you can use for pretty cheap in a very quick animation. And best of all yet, if you use this skill while you are one shot, and you go ahead and drink your flask and get back to full health, you will still retain the same buff, that same 27% damage. So this weapon skill is going to be a very solid alternative to Cragblade. I probably wouldn't value it as much as Cragblade because that one does last longer, going to be like less situational. So if you are going to go with those charged heavy attack builds, Cragblade is going to be better. But in most other cases, I would recommend using Shriek of Sorrow because you can use this skill easily throughout the fight. Wing Stance, which is a skill for the light greatswords. Now this skill also goes into a stance, of which for 8 FP, you do the light attack input, which is a bunch of these flurrying attacks. Can do some nice damage, can stagger those enemies quickly, can help you proc those multi-hit talismans. Now it obviously does have you get stuck in that longer animation with like a 3 hits combo, so I wouldn't really use it against those larger enemies that move around a whole bunch because they are going to stagger you out of it. But for me, the best part of the skill is going to be the heavy attack input, which for only 10 FP, you jump up in the air and like lunge really quickly towards an enemy, which one is obviously going to be really good at closing a distance. You can kind of treat it as a projectile attack, just be far away and just lunge at the enemy, of which this lunge can result in high damage. It's going to be doing piercing damage, which is like the best damage type in the game. And best of all yet, it is going to do 30 stance damage, which that's more stance damage than most of the other skills in this game. And it does it in a really quick poking attack. And also the character jumps before lunging, so therefore a lot of attacks can just go directly underneath you. Number 3, Palm Blast, which is a skill for the hand-to-hand weapons, and I think this one is just the best skill to use for these types of weapons for a multitude of different reasons. Number 1 is that it does do a nice damaging attack. Does do some nice stance damage. When it's uncharged, it is only 10 stance damage, but it is a quick attack. But when fully charged, it does 36 stance damage, which is just as much as a greatsword with Lion's Claw. Now, this animation is going to be fairly long, but as you see, you get like infinite hype armor. You're like never going to get staggered out of this attack at all. There hasn't been a single time where I've used this skill and I've been staggered out of it. And it only consumes 14 FP. Now, against those super really hard-hitting enemies with its crazy-ass attacks, it's probably not going to be the most viable thing, like for some of the bosses in the DLC. But against almost every other type of smaller enemy, this thing can straight up just cheese them. It is just that good and that easy to use. Number 2, we have Flame Spear, which is a skill that can be equipped on all weapons capable of thrusting attacks. And yeah, this is going to be another fire-based poking attack that also does buff your weapon. The attack itself is very high damaging, and the buff is going to be a plus 95 fire buff for 40 seconds. And the animation itself is also very quick, so you can just use it to just buff your weapon. And for only 19 FP, you can't really go wrong. But the best part about the skill is going to be its fully charged state. Because when you have this thing fully charged, it like extends the fire-based projectile to go like so much further, and it travels like instantly and just does amazing damage. And throughout this animation, you also do get hyper armor, so you don't have to really worry about getting staggered out of it. And if you hit with this thing at point blank range, you're doing 38 stance damage. Now this is specifically with these larger types of weapons like a Colossal Sword. With smaller weapons, you're not going to be doing as much. And also this is just going to be at point blank range. The projectile part is not going to be doing that much. It's going to be doing a lot less stance damage. But yeah, for how cheap it is, how much damage it does do, the fact that it buffs your weapon, and how easy it is to use as well, it definitely deserves to be number 2. Number 1, CARIAN Sovereignty. I honestly don't even know where to begin with this thing. It is definitely the best Ash of War in the entire game, bar none. That is base game, DLC included. Yeah, but as you can see, it is very similar to CARIAN Grandeur, which CARIAN Grandeur is one of the best Ashes in the game. You can fully charge it 3 times and just do like incredible damage. The only downsides of CARIAN Grandeur is obviously going to be that longer animation. Doesn't really get much hyper armor. But yeah, this thing has basically no downsides. You still have to charge it up, which might take a little bit, but you get hyper armor with this thing somehow, don't know why. So you can just tank attacks. You only need to charge it up like once basically to reach its maximum potential. Now the first initial slam isn't going to be doing as much damage as maybe a fully charged CARIAN Grandeur, but it does get a follow-up input that comes out very quickly that basically does just as much damage in a wide horizontal swipe, so it can hit multiple enemies at once and hit enemies that like to dodge and move around. But best of all yet, the stance damage is insane. The first attack does 48 stance damage, which that is like more than almost every single skill in the entire game. And the follow-up attack does 43 stance damage. That is 91 stance damage in one combo that you get hyper armor in at such insane range with stupid damage and for only 26 FP. Like, if you don't know how much 91 stance damage is, bosses like Malekith or Millennia, they only have 80 poise. So you can stance break in one combo with these weapons. There are some bosses in the DLC that have about 100 poise. Radagon has 100 poise. Godfrey has 120 poise. So if you go ahead and use something like the Stone Barbed Cracked Tier, you can poise break those enemies too in just one combo. Like, this thing is just insane. And if you wanted to know, you can use this with like almost every weapon in the game. Like almost every single sword, you can equip this weapon. Just pair it alongside a magic-based infusion, go all into intelligence, and everything's just gonna die. You're welcome. There you go. Use it while you can because it's going to get nerfed, I promise you. Anyway, that is now the video done and completed. The next one is going to be covering all of the spells. Gonna go rank the incantations and the sorceries from the DLC. Then I'm gonna go make videos on the talismans, crystal tiers, and eventually do a tier list of all the weapons. So definitely do subscribe for that. And also do follow me on Twitch because I do all of my testing there as well. So if you do want to see the results live, go give me a follow there. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.